They said the Duke of Ravenshade had no heart, that whatever lived inside his chest pumped something colder than blood, something closer to ambition distilled into liquid and forced through veins that had long forgotten warmth. They were wrong. Lucian Blackthorne had a heart. He had simply learned, through years of betrayal and inheritance soaked in cruelty, that a heart was the first thing your enemies would aim for. So he buried his. Deep. Beneath stone walls and silence, and a reputation so vicious that grown men lost their nerve at the sound of his name. If you want to understand what power costs a man willing to pay the full price, stay until the very end. Because this story does not flinch. The marriage was announced on a Tuesday, not with celebration, not with the gilded proclamations that typically accompanied unions between great houses. Lord Aldrich Vale received the letter at his country estate in the late hours of a November evening, and when he set it down on the mahogany desk, his hands were trembling. Not from joy, from the particular species of dread that visits a man who understands he has just sold his daughter to something he cannot control. The letter bore the Blackthorn seal, a raven clutching a sword in its talons, pressed into wax so black it looked like a wound in the parchment. 3 sentences. No pleasantries, no flowery language about honor or legacy or the joining of noble bloodlines. Lucian Blackthorne did not waste words on people he considered beneath him, and he considered everyone beneath him. Lord Vale read those 3 sentences 4 times. Then he poured himself a drink, then another. By the 3rd glass, he had convinced himself that compliance was not cowardice, that strategic surrender was, in fact, the hallmark of intelligent men, that his daughter Seraphina would understand. She did not understand. "You cannot be serious." Seraphina stood in the doorway of her father's study, still wearing her riding coat, mud from the afternoon's hunt still drying on her boots. She had been summoned from the stables with the kind of urgency usually reserved for deaths. "You are telling me you agreed to this without even consulting me." Lord Vale did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the window where rain streaked the glass in long, uneven lines. "It was not a proposal, Seraphina. It was an arrangement, the kind that does not come with the luxury of negotiation. An arrangement." She said the word like she was testing its weight, finding it heavier than it had any right to be. "You mean a transaction?" "I mean survival." He turned then, and she saw it, the thing he had been trying to hide behind the whiskey and the controlled posture. Fear. Raw, animal fear, the kind that strips a man of everything except the instinct to protect what little he has left. "The Vale estate is bleeding. Our creditors are circling. The Northern Territories are one bad harvest from open revolt, and every ally we once relied on has quietly repositioned themselves behind the Blackthorn banner. I did not choose this. I was given this, and the alternative was ruin." Seraphina crossed the room slowly. She did not sit. She stood before his desk the way she always stood when she was calculating something, feet slightly apart, chin level, eyes focused on a point just past his shoulder as though she were reading a document only she could see. "What does he want?" "A wife." Lucian Blackthorne does not want a wife. Every matchmaker in the northern counties has thrown their finest daughters at that fortress for a decade, and he has sent every single one of them home. What does he actually want? Lord Vale swallowed. "The Vale shipping routes, our ports, access to the southern trade channels that his duchy cannot reach by land." The silence that followed was surgical. It cut through the room and left everything exposed. Seraphina stared at her father for a long time. Not with anger, though anger was certainly part of it. Not with betrayal, though that was there too, pulsing just beneath the surface like a second heartbeat. What dominated her expression was something far more dangerous. Clarity, the kind that comes when a person finally sees the shape of the cage being built around them and decides, in that very instant, to memorize every bar. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks. "Does he know anything about me?" "He knows your name, your lineage, the strategic value of your family's assets." Lord Vale paused. "I doubt he cares about anything beyond that." Seraphina pulled her riding gloves off one finger at a time. She laid them on his desk with a precision that made the gesture feel like a statement. "Then he is already making his first mistake." She left the room without another word. Lord Vale listened to her boots on the stone hallway until the sound disappeared, and then he sat down heavily and stared at the blackthorn seal still gleaming on his desk. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself this was pragmatism. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where honesty lives when a man is too tired to lie to himself, he knew exactly what he had done. He had thrown his only daughter into a wolf's den and called it diplomacy. The wedding took place at Ravenshade Castle on a morning so cold the breath of the assembled guests hung in the chapel air like ghosts that refused to leave. Seraphina arrived in a carriage that had traveled 2 days through frozen roads, and when the iron gates of the estate groaned open, she got her first look at the place that would become her prison. Ravenshade was not a home. It was a declaration. The castle erupted from the cliffs like something geological, like the earth itself had decided to make a fist and hold it there for centuries. Towers of black stone pierced a sky heavy with clouds. The outer walls stretched in both directions until they vanished into mist, enclosing ground so vast they contained their own weather. Below, the sea threw itself against the rocks with a violence that sounded personal, as though the water had a grudge against the land and intended to settle it one wave at a time. Every window was dark. The ceremony was efficient. Lucien stood at the altar in black, because he always wore black, because color was a concession to warmth, and warmth was a concession to vulnerability, and Lucien Blackthorn did not make concessions. He was tall. That was the first thing Seraphina noticed. Not merely tall in the way that wealth and posture can manufacture, but tall in the way that certain men are tall, where the height itself feels like a weapon, like the additional inches exist specifically to ensure that everyone in the room must look up. His face was constructed from sharp angles and deliberate stillness. Dark hair swept back from a forehead that looked carved rather than grown. His jaw could have been used to draw straight lines. And his eyes. God, his eyes were the color of winter storms, gray shot through with something metallic, something that caught the candlelight and refused to give it back. Those eyes settled on Seraphina as she walked toward him, and they performed an assessment so thorough, so clinical, so utterly devoid of admiration that she felt the temperature in the chapel drop another degree. He did not smile. He did not speak. When the officiant finished, Lucien took her hand with the grip of a man signing a contract, and the ring slid onto her finger like a shackle finding its proper home. The wedding feast was attended by 40 nobles, none of whom appeared to be enjoying themselves. Conversation was muted. Laughter, when it occurred, was the nervous kind, the kind that people produce when silence feels more dangerous than noise. Lucien sat at the head of the long table and ate precisely, cutting his meat with the geometric accuracy of a man who applied discipline to everything, including the angle of his knife. Seraphina sat beside him. She had not spoken to him yet. Not a single word exchanged between husband and wife. She watched the room instead, cataloging faces, reading postures, noting which guests leaned toward Lucien with genuine deference and which ones wore their smiles like armor. There was a man at the far end of the table, heavy-set with a reddish beard, whose eyes kept darting to Lucien with something that was not quite loyalty and not quite resentment, but lived somewhere in the volatile territory between the two. She filed him away. It was Lucien who broke the silence between them, and when he did, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it, a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. You will take your meals in the east dining hall, alone. Seraphina's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down. Starting when? Starting tomorrow. Your quarters are in the east wing. You will find them adequate. The staff will attend to your basic needs. I trust you will not require excessive accommodation. And if I do? He turned his head. Not all the way. Just enough to let those storm gray eyes land on her with their full, devastating weight. Then you will learn to live with disappointment. It is one of the few things this marriage will provide in abundance. She held his gaze. Most people could not. Most people, when Lucien Blackthorn looked at them directly, experienced something close to what small animals feel when a shadow passes overhead. But Seraphina held it. She held it the way someone holds a blade that is cutting into their palm, not because it does not hurt, but because letting go would mean admitting it does. I was told you were ruthless, she said. I was not told you were petty. Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, so fast that anyone watching would have missed it. Annoyance, yes. But underneath the annoyance, something else. Something that lived in a locked room inside Lucian Blackthorn and heard a knock for the first time in years. He did not respond. He returned to his meal with the same mechanical precision, and the conversation was over. But his jaw was set a fraction tighter than before, and Seraphina noticed. The east wing of Ravenshade Castle was a masterwork of deliberate isolation. Seraphina discovered this on her first morning as Duchess, when she woke in a bedchamber so large that the far wall existed more as a suggestion than a boundary. The ceiling vaulted above her like the inside of a cathedral stripped of its purpose, ornate plasterwork depicting scenes of conquest and dominion that no one had bothered to illuminate with adequate candlelight. Her breakfast arrived on a silver tray carried by a servant named Agnes, a woman whose face had been trained into such thorough neutrality that it could have been used as a template for diplomatic correspondence. Agnes set the tray down, curtsied, and was halfway to the door before Seraphina spoke. "Agnes?" The servant stopped. "Yes, Your Grace?" "How many servants attend the East Wing?" "3, Your Grace, myself, Thomas for the fires, and Mr. Hargrove, who manages the wing's accounts and correspondence." "3, for an entire wing of a castle this size." "Those are His Grace's instructions." Seraphina looked at the tray. The food was adequate. Not lavish, not insulting, but portioned with the careful restraint of someone following orders to provide exactly enough and not a crumb more. She lifted the silver cover from the plate and found a single egg, 2 pieces of toast, and a pot of tea that was precisely large enough for 1 cup. "Agnes, I would like to see the household accounts for the East Wing." The servant's neutrality cracked, just barely, a hairline fracture of surprise that she sealed almost instantly. "The household accounts are managed by Lord Ashworth, the Duke's chief steward. I would not have access to—" "I did not ask who manages them. I asked to see them." Agnes hesitated. In that hesitation lived an entire architecture of fear. The servant was calculating, weighing the discomfort of defying a duchess against the terror of crossing a duke, and the mathematics were clearly not in Seraphina's favor. "I will inquire, Your Grace." "Do that." Agnes left, and Seraphina ate her single egg and drank her single cup of tea and began to think. Not about escape. Escape was what a frightened woman would consider, and Seraphina had decided sometime between her father's study and the altar at Ravenshade that she would not be frightened. Fear was a resource, like coal, like timber. You could burn it for warmth if you knew how to control the flame, or you could let it consume you. She intended to burn it. The East Dining Hall where she was condemned to take her meals was a room designed to make one person feel spectacularly small. It could have seated 60. A table ran nearly the entire length of it, dark wood polished to a shine that reflected the candelabras positioned at intervals like sentinels. Seraphina sat at one end, alone. The sound of her silverware against the plate echoed off stone walls and came back to her like mockery. She ate there that evening. And the next. And the next. Each meal a performance of solitude staged in a room built for grandeur, and each meal a lesson in the particular kind of cruelty that does not require violence. Lucien was not beating her. He was not starving her. He was doing something far more calculated. He was making her irrelevant. Reducing a duchess to a ghost in her own castle, present but invisible, titled but powerless, married but utterly alone. By the 4th day, she had memorized the layout of the East Wing. By the 6th, she had charmed Thomas into bringing her extra candles, not through manipulation, but through the simple, devastating tactic of treating him like a human being, something the staff of Ravenshade had clearly not experienced from their master. By the 8th day, she had obtained the household ledgers, not through Agnes. Agnes was too terrified. Seraphina got them through Mr. Hargrove, the East Wing's account manager, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the permanently startled expression of someone who had been overlooked for so long that attention itself felt like an ambush. She asked him to tea. He came reluctantly. She asked him about the wing's operating budget. He answered nervously. She asked him about the broader estate accounts, and he went pale. "Your Grace, I really should not— Mr. Hargrove, you have managed correspondence for this wing for 11 years. In that time, how many people have asked you a single question about your work?" He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it. Then very quietly he said, "None, Your Grace." "Then consider me the first, and consider this. I'm not asking you to betray anyone. I'm asking you to show me the numbers. Numbers do not have loyalties, Mr. Hargrove. They simply tell the truth." He brought her the ledgers the following morning, 3 leather-bound volumes covering the past 5 years of Ravenshade's finances. Seraphina cleared the vast dining table, spread the books open under the candlelight, and began to read. What she found made her sit very still for a very long time. The estate was not merely mismanaged, it was being systematically devoured. Revenue from the northern tenant farms had dropped 40% in 3 years, but the recorded expenses for those same farms had somehow tripled. Timber contracts bore signatures that did not match any authorized agent. Shipping tariffs that should have filled the ducal treasury were being rerouted through a series of intermediary accounts that led, through careful tracing, to a name that appeared with disturbing frequency in the margins of every questionable transaction. Lord Ashworth, the Duke's chief steward, the man who controlled every coin that entered and exited Ravenshade. Seraphina closed the ledger. She pressed her fingers against her temples and breathed. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that any rational person trapped in a hostile castle with no allies and a husband who had made isolation an art form would do, was nothing. Close the books, return them to Mr. Hargrove, eat her single egg and drink her single cup of tea, and wait for time to grind the edges off her captivity. She reopened the ledger and started taking notes. 2 weeks into the marriage, Lucien summoned her to his study. The summons arrived via a footman who delivered it with the rigid formality of a man delivering sentencing instructions. Seraphina followed him through corridors she had not yet been permitted to walk, past rooms whose doors were closed with the finality of vaults, up a staircase that climbed into the central tower where the Duke conducted the business of his duchy. The study was a room that had been built to intimidate and had succeeded brilliantly. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the cliffs and the churning sea below. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled not with decorative volumes but with legal texts, estate records, military histories, the accumulated intelligence of generations of Blackthorns who had understood that knowledge was the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal. Lucien sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a fortification. He did not stand when she entered. He did not invite her to sit. He simply looked at her with those gray eyes and let the silence do its work. Seraphina sat anyway. Something shifted in his expression. Minute, controlled, like a door being locked from the inside. "I did not offer you a seat. You did not offer me a greeting either. I assumed we were dispensing with formalities." He studied her for a long moment, the way a general studies a map, looking for weaknesses, supply lines, places where pressure might yield collapse. "I am told you have been requesting household documents." "I have. Why?" "Because I am the Duchess of Ravenshade, and the household documents are part of the estate I am now legally bound to." "You are the Duchess of Ravenshade in title. The distinction between title and authority seems to have escaped you." Seraphina leaned forward. Not aggressively, precisely, the way a surgeon leans toward an incision. "The distinction has not escaped me, Your Grace. I simply find it interesting that you went to the trouble of acquiring a wife, at considerable political cost, and then immediately ensured she had no function whatsoever. If you wanted an ornament, you could have bought a painting. It would have been cheaper and significantly less likely to ask uncomfortable questions." Lucien's hands were flat on the desk. His fingers did not move. His posture did not change. But something behind the controlled facade recalibrated. He was not accustomed to this. Not the defiance. He had faced defiance before and crushed it with the mechanical efficiency of a man stepping on an insect. This was different. This was precision. This woman was not flailing against her circumstances. She was dissecting them. "What questions?" he asked. And in those 2 words, buried beneath the authority and the coldness and the granite composure, there was something that had not been there before. Curiosity. Unwilling, reluctant, dragged out of hiding against its will, but present. Seraphina reached into the document case she had carried with her. She placed 3 pages on his desk. Columns of figures. Annotated discrepancies. A timeline of financial irregularities spanning 3 years. Each entry cross-referenced with specific ledger pages, specific transactions, specific names, Your estate is losing approximately £12,000 per year to internal theft, she said. The hemorrhaging is concentrated in three areas: timber contracts in the Northern Territories, shipping tariffs through the coastal routes, and agricultural revenue from the tenant farms east of the river. Every compromised transaction passes through your chief steward's office. Every forged authorization bears a seal that Lord Ashworth controls exclusively. Lucian did not touch the papers. He stared at them the way a man stares at a wound he has just discovered on his own body. Something dark moved through his expression. Not surprise. He was not a man who permitted himself surprise. Rage. Cold, tightly wound rage that he held behind his teeth the way a dog holds a bone. "You have been in this castle for 2 weeks," he said, and his voice had dropped to a register that the servants of Ravenshade would have recognized as the one that preceded consequences. "Yes. And in 2 weeks you claim to have uncovered a conspiracy that my own financial advisors have missed for 3 years. Your financial advisors did not miss it. Your financial advisors are profiting from it. The numbers are on your desk, Your Grace. They do not require belief. They require arithmetic." The silence that filled the study was the kind that has weight. It pressed against the windows. It settled into the corners. It wrapped itself around both of them, like smoke from a fire that had not yet been located. Lucien picked up the first page. He read it. His eyes moved across the figures with the speed of a man who had been reading financial documents since before he could ride a horse. He picked up the second page. The third. The rage behind his expression did not diminish. It concentrated. It became something denser, something that had weight and heat. And the patient, terrible promise of a man who has just learned that the walls he built to protect himself have been hollowed out from the inside. He set the papers down. He looked at her. "Leave." "I would prefer to discuss—" "I said leave." The command filled the room like a physical force. It was not shouting. Lucian Blackthorne did not shout. It was something worse. It was volume achieved through compression, every syllable loaded with the kind of authority that does not request compliance but assumes it the way gravity assumes downward. Seraphina stood. She collected her document case. She walked to the door. And then she stopped. Not because she had something clever to say. Not because she wanted the last word. She stopped because something in her, some instinct that lived deeper than strategy, deeper than self-preservation, made her turn back. He was staring at the papers, and for one unguarded fraction of a second, before the armor slammed back into place, she saw something on his face that rearranged everything she thought she knew about Lucien Blackthorne. Not anger, not cruelty, not the cold machinery of a man who had turned his heart into a fortress. Hurt. The raw, unmistakable wound of a man who has just discovered that the people he trusted to maintain his kingdom were the ones dismantling it. A man who had built his entire existence on the principle that control was safety, that surveillance was protection, that if he held every thread tightly enough, nothing could unravel. And the threads were already gone. Someone had been cutting them for years, and he had not felt a thing. She left without speaking. The door closed behind her, and the sound echoed through the corridor like a verdict. That night, Seraphina ate alone in the great dining hall as always. 1 plate, 1 cup. The candelabras throwing their long shadows across 60 empty chairs. But for the first time since arriving at Ravenshade, her mind was not on the isolation or the cold or the particular cruelty of a husband who treated silence as a weapon. Her mind was on that fraction of a second, that unguarded moment when the Duke of Ravenshade looked like a man instead of a monument. And somewhere in the central tower, Lucien Blackthorne sat in his study long after midnight, staring at 3 pages of numbers that his wife had placed on his desk, and realized with a fury so complete it left no room for anything else that the woman he had married to control was the only person in his entire fortress who had told him the truth. He picked up a pen. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward him, and he began writing a letter to Lord Ashworth. A letter that began, very simply, very quietly, with the words, "You are summoned." But 3 floors below, in the servants' corridor that connected the east wing to the main house, a figure moved through the shadows with the practiced silence of someone who had been moving through shadows for a very long time. The figure paused at a door, listened, then slipped a folded note beneath it, a note addressed to Lord Ashworth, bearing no signature, no seal, only 6 words that would change everything. The Duchess knows. Move the ledgers. Lord Ashworth received the note at 20 minutes past 1 in the morning. He was not asleep. Men who steal from dukes do not sleep well, and men who have been stealing from Lucian Blackthorne for 3 years do not sleep at all. They exist in a state of permanent calculation, a twilight consciousness where every creak of floorboard, every unexpected summons, every shift in the Duke's tone registers as a potential death sentence. So when the folded paper appeared beneath his door, Ashworth was already sitting upright in a leather chair beside a fire he had let burn too low, a glass of port balanced on his knee, his eyes fixed on nothing. He read the 6 words. He read them again. Then he set the note on the arm of the chair with the exaggerated care of a man handling something explosive. The Duchess knows. Move the ledgers. His first instinct was denial. Not the emotional kind, not the desperate flailing of a man caught off guard, but the strategic variety. The kind that reassembles facts into a more favorable architecture and presents the result as reason. The Duchess had been here less than 3 weeks. She was confined to the East Wing. She had no allies, no access to the central treasury, no authority beyond the decorative title her husband had stapled to her name like an afterthought. What could she possibly know? But Ashworth had not survived this long by trusting his own comfort. He finished the port. He stood. He crossed to the heavy oak bureau in the corner of his chambers where the real ledgers lived, the ones that did not match the versions he presented to the Duke, the ones that contained the actual numbers, the actual destinations, the actual names of every man who had taken a cut of the fortune being siphoned from Ravenshade's coffers. 3 ledgers, bound in unmarked leather. Together they represented enough evidence to hang him twice and destroy 6 noble families in the process. He wrapped them in oilcloth. He placed them in a leather satchel. And then he did what every cornered animal does when the walls begin to close. He started thinking about who else needed to die. Lucian's letter arrived at Ashworth's office at precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, delivered by a footman whose expression suggested he would rather have been carrying a live snake. Ashworth read the summons with the composed face of a man who had been expecting it, which he had, and walked the long corridor to the Duke's study with the measured stride of someone who understood that speed betrays panic and panic betrays guilt. The study was exactly as it always was. Windows overlooking the cliffs, bookshelves like walls within walls, and Lucien behind the desk, already dressed in black, already radiating the particular frequency of controlled fury that made the air around him feel thinner, harder to breathe, as though his displeasure consumed oxygen. "Sit," Lucien said. Ashworth sat. He arranged his features into attentive neutrality, the expression he had perfected over years of standing in this room and lying to this man's face. "The Northern Timber contracts," Lucien said. No preamble. No courtesy. He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "Explain the discrepancy between recorded revenue and actual yield for the past 3 seasons." Ashworth glanced at the paper. His heartbeat did not change. His hands remained still on the arms of his chair. Somewhere deep inside his chest, in the place where self-preservation lives when it has nowhere else to go, a mechanism engaged. The same mechanism that had kept him alive through years of embezzlement, years of forged signatures, years of redirecting the wealth of one of the most powerful duchies in the country into accounts that bore names Lucian Blackthorne had never heard. "Market fluctuations," Ashworth said. "Timber prices dropped considerably after the southern mills expanded. I noted the adjustment in my quarterly reports. You noted a 12% adjustment. The actual loss is closer to 40. With respect, Your Grace, the secondary calculations account for maintenance costs, labor increases, and transport fees that were absorbed into the operating budget rather than itemized separately. If you refer to the supplementary annexes, I have referred to them. They do not exist." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Ashworth felt the ripple. He felt it in his spine, in the slight tightening of his diaphragm, in the way his vision narrowed by a fraction as his body began routing blood to the organs that would need it most if this conversation went where he suspected it was going. "I can produce them by end of day. You will produce them now, along with the shipping tariff records for the coastal routes and the agricultural revenue statements for the eastern farms. All original documents, not copies, not summaries. Originals." Ashworth's mouth was dry. Not visibly, not in any way that would register on his carefully maintained exterior, but dry in the way that a man's mouth goes dry when he realizes the ground he has been standing on is not ground at all, but a surface stretched over nothing, and the first crack has just appeared. Of course, Your Grace, I will have my clerks compile. Your clerks will not be involved. You will retrieve the documents personally. You will bring them to this desk by noon. Lucian's eyes had not moved from Ashworth's face. Not once. Not a flicker of distraction, not a glance at the window or the papers or anything other than the man sitting across from him. It was the gaze of someone who was not looking at a person, but through one, into the architecture of deception behind the skin, reading the load-bearing lies and calculating which one to pull first. If there are discrepancies, I will find them. If there are fabrications, I will identify them. And if there is theft, Ashworth, I will not send for magistrates. I will handle it personally. Do you understand what that means? Ashworth understood. Every person who had ever stood in this room understood. Lucian Blackthorne did not threaten. He described. He laid out consequences with the flat, informational tone of a man reading weather reports, and the weather was always the same. Catastrophic, absolute, without appeal. Perfectly, Your Grace. Then go. Ashworth left the study. He walked the corridor with the same measured stride. He turned the corner. He descended the staircase, and the moment he was out of sight, his composure cracked like ice over a river in March. His hands shook. His jaw locked so tight that pain shot through his molars. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall and breathed, and in that breathing was the sound of a man recalculating every assumption he had ever made about how long this game could last. The original documents did not exist, not the real ones. The ones Ashworth had been presenting for 3 years were fabrications, beautiful fabrications, works of financial fiction so meticulously constructed that they had fooled auditors, advisors, and a duke whose attention to detail was legendary. But fabrications require a foundation, and that foundation was the set of actual records that Ashworth had hidden, moved, altered, and as of 1 o'clock this morning, removed from the estate entirely. He had until noon. 6 hours to manufacture originals that would withstand the scrutiny of a man who read financial documents the way other men read novels. It could not be done. Not perfectly. Not well enough. Which meant the game had changed. He found Lord Pemberton in the West Gallery, examining a portrait of some dead Blackthorne ancestor with the performative appreciation of a man who wanted to be seen being cultured. Pemberton was 53, stout, perpetually flushed, and in possession of 3 estates that had been quietly subsidized for the past 2 years by money diverted from Ravenshade's treasury. He was also, by Ashworth's careful design, so deeply complicit that betrayal was no longer an option. Shared guilt was Ashworth's favorite form of loyalty. "We have a problem," Ashworth said quietly, standing beside Pemberton and pretending to study the portrait. Pemberton did not turn his head. "What kind?" "The kind that ends with our heads on pikes if we do not act decisively within the next 12 hours. Pemberton's flush deepened by 2 shades. "How much does he know?" "Enough." The Duchess found the discrepancies. She brought them to him directly. The Duchess. Pemberton said the word like it was a species of insect he had not previously encountered. The woman he locked in the East Wing with 3 servants and a tea service. "The same." "How?" "She got the ledgers. The household accounts. She traced the irregularities back to my office." Ashworth's voice was clinical, stripped of emotion, the voice of a man who has moved past fear into the narrow, airless corridor of pure operational thinking where feelings are a luxury and survival is a series of mechanical decisions. She is significantly more intelligent than we anticipated. She is a Vale. They breed negotiators, not investigators. And yet here we are. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. The portrait stared down at them, some 18th century Blackthorne with the same jawline as Lucien and the same gray eyes, painted in a pose of absolute authority that now felt less like art and more like surveillance. "What do you need?" Pemberton asked. "A council meeting. Tomorrow. Before the Duke has time to conduct a full audit. I need Hartwick, Fairfax, and the Ashford brothers present. Every man whose name appears in those ledgers needs to be in one room understanding that if one of us falls, all of us fall." And the Duchess? Ashworth's jaw tightened. The Duchess is the immediate problem. Remove her influence and the Duke returns to his default state, controlled, isolated, dependent on the information we provide him. Remove her influence how? Ashworth turned away from the portrait. He looked at Pemberton with the flat, evaluative gaze of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. By giving the Duke a reason to distrust her more than he distrusts us. The meeting happened that same evening, not in the castle. In the hunting lodge 3 miles south of the estate, a stone building set deep in woodland that had been used by Ravenshade's nobility for generations when they needed to discuss things that walls with ears should not hear. 5 men gathered around a rough oak table. Ashworth, Pemberton, Lord Hartwick, thin and precise, a man who spoke rarely but whose silences carried the weight of verdicts. Sir Edmund Fairfax, whose family controlled the shipping routes that Ashworth had been exploiting, and the Ashford brothers, Gerald and Marcus, identical in build and temperament, men whose loyalty could be purchased, but, once purchased, remained remarkably consistent. Ashworth laid it out without embellishment. The Duchess had found the discrepancies. She had presented evidence to the Duke. The Duke had demanded original documents that did not exist in any form that would survive scrutiny. Every man at this table was implicated. Every man at this table stood to lose his estate, his title, his freedom, and very possibly his life if Lucien Blackthorne was permitted to follow the thread his wife had placed in his hands. Hartwick spoke first. How much time do we have? Days? Perhaps less. Once he realizes the originals I produce are insufficient, he will begin his own investigation. And Blackthorne does not investigate the way other men investigate. He dismantles. He will pull apart every financial structure in this duchy until he finds the rot, and when he finds it, he will not pause to determine degrees of guilt. He will burn everything. Then we discredit the source, Fairfax said. The Duchess. Her findings are based on household accounts she obtained without authorization. We argue that the numbers she presented are incomplete, taken out of context, manipulated by a woman with no understanding of estate finance who is attempting to undermine established authority for personal gain. That might have worked a week ago, Ashworth said, before she put 3 pages of forensic analysis on his desk that even I would have difficulty refuting. The woman did not simply find errors. She constructed a case, timeline, cross-references, pattern analysis. She did in 2 weeks what our own auditors were paid not to do in 3 years. Gerald Ashford leaned forward. Then we do not discredit her work. We discredit her. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of agreement, but the charged quiet that precedes a decision from which there is no return. Every man at the table understood what was being proposed. Not an intellectual exercise, not a strategic maneuver, something darker, something that, once set in motion, would either save them all or destroy them all, with no middle ground. Explain, Ashworth said. The Duke married her for her family's shipping routes. He has no attachment to her, no affection. He isolated her the moment she arrived. The marriage is a transaction, and transactions can be voided if one party is shown to be acting in bad faith. Gerald's voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had done this before, who had learned that the most effective lies are the ones built on a foundation of partial truth. We manufacture evidence that the Duchess has been communicating with rival houses, that her investigation of the estate finances is not the work of a concerned wife, but a coordinated effort by the Vale family to map Ravenshade's vulnerabilities for external exploitation. We turn her greatest strength into proof of treachery. Ashworth stared at him. The firelight from the lodge's hearth threw shadows across the table that made every face look sharper, more angular, less human. He thought about the risk. He thought about the variables. He thought about Lucien Blackthorne sitting in his study at midnight, staring at 3 pages of numbers with an expression that Ashworth had never seen on that face before. An expression that suggested the Duke's armor had cracked in a way that a woman, specifically this woman, might be able to widen. That was the real danger. Not the numbers, not the evidence. The danger was that Lucien might listen to her, might trust her, might allow the Duchess to occupy a position of influence that would make Ashworth's continued survival impossible. A Duke who trusted no one, could be managed. A duke who trusted the wrong person, the right person, the one person who had actually looked at the books and done the math, could not. "Do it," Ashworth said. The forged letters were masterful. 3 of them, written on paper that matched the Vale family's personal stationery, sealed with a replica of Lord Vale's insignia that Fairfax had commissioned from a craftsman in the southern provinces 6 months prior for an entirely different scheme. The letters outlined a coordinated plan by the Vale family to use Seraphina's position inside Ravenshade as an intelligence-gathering operation, mapping the duchy's financial weaknesses, identifying exploitable contracts, and preparing the ground for a hostile commercial takeover of Blackthorn trade routes. Every detail was calibrated to exploit Lucien's psychology, his paranoia, his belief that trust was a trap, his fundamental conviction that every person who entered his orbit did so with an agenda, and that the agenda was always extraction. The letters did not need to be perfectly convincing. They needed to be just convincing enough to activate the machinery of suspicion that Lucien had spent a lifetime building, and once that machinery engaged, it would do the rest of the work on its own. Ashworth delivered the fabricated financial documents to the Duke's study at 11:40 in the morning, 20 minutes ahead of the deadline. He placed them on the desk with an expression of cooperative diligence. He answered Lucien's questions with the smooth, detailed precision of a man who has rehearsed every answer to every possible question and found the seams in his own story before anyone else could. Lucien reviewed them in silence. His eyes moved across the pages with that same unsettling speed, that same mechanical thoroughness, and Ashworth watched for the moment of acceptance. The moment when the fabricated numbers would align closely enough with the Duchess's findings to suggest honest discrepancy rather than systemic theft. It did not come. "These are reconstructions," Lucien said. Ashworth's pulse spiked. 1 beat. He contained it. "Your Grace?" These documents were not retrieved from archive storage. They were created recently. The ink saturation is uniform across every page. Genuine documents aged in storage develop variations in density due to humidity and temperature fluctuation. These have none. Lucien set the papers down with a gentleness that was somehow worse than violence. "You have 48 hours, Ashworth, not to produce better forgeries, to produce the truth. If I must find it myself, I will find everything. And I suspect everything is considerably more than what my wife has already uncovered." Ashworth left the study for the second time in 2 days. This time his stride was not measured. This time the composure did not crack in the hallway, but in his own chambers, where he locked the door and stood with his back against it, and breathed in ragged, uneven pulls of air that sounded like a man drowning on dry land. 48 hours. He sent the forged Vale letters that evening, placed in a document folder marked Intercepted Correspondence, and delivered to the Duke's desk by a junior clerk who had been told they were recovered from a routine mail inspection. The clerk had no reason to question the instruction. Junior clerks at Ravenshade did not question instructions. They followed them, quickly and silently, because the alternative was drawing the Duke's attention, and the Duke's attention was the most expensive thing in the castle. In the East Wing, Seraphina did not know the letters existed. She was sitting at the long dining table surrounded by her notes, working through a second pass of the financial discrepancies with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the numbers she had found were not the whole story. They were the visible architecture of a much larger structure, and the parts she could not see were the parts that would matter most. Mr. Hargrove brought her tea. She thanked him. He lingered in the doorway with the hesitant posture of a man who wanted to say something but lacked the vocabulary for the kind of warning he needed to deliver. "Your Grace," he said, "I feel I should mention, there have been visitors to the West Corridor, late at night, several men. I recognized Lord Pemberton and Sir Fairfax." Seraphina looked up from her notes. "When?" "Last evening, and again this morning, early, before dawn." "Did you see where they went?" "The hunting lodge, Your Grace. The old one in the South Wood." Seraphina set down her pen. She looked at Mr. Hargrove for a long moment, and in that look was the precise, unsentimental calculation of a woman who understood that information delivered by a frightened man in a doorway was often worth more than information found in a ledger. "Mr. Hargrove, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to understand that what I am asking carries risk. His face went pale, paler than usual, which was already considerable. What kind of risk, Your Grace? The kind that matters. I need the names of every clerk, every messenger, every servant who has carried documents between Lord Ashworth's office and the Duke's study in the past 72 hours. Can you do that? He swallowed. His throat moved visibly, the cartilage shifting beneath skin that was too thin and too white, and in that movement was the entire weight of a decision that would either save him or condemn him. He was a small man, a man who had survived by being invisible, by being useful enough to keep and insignificant enough to ignore. And now a duchess was asking him to become visible in a castle where visibility meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant destruction. Yes, Your Grace, he whispered. I can do that. He left. Seraphina sat alone in the dining hall with its 60 empty chairs and its echoing silence and its candelabras burning low. She picked up her pen. She returned to the numbers, but her hand was not as steady as it had been because she understood now, with a clarity that sat in her stomach like cold iron, that the conspiracy she had uncovered was not passive. It was not a crime of opportunity or laziness or greed left unchecked. It was organized. It was defended. And it had just learned her name. 3 floors above, Lucien Nassay in Blackthorn opened the folder marked Intercepted Correspondence and began to read the forged letters that accused his wife of treason. His face did not change. His breathing did not alter. But his hand, the hand that held the first letter, developed a tremor so slight that only a man watching his own hand with the desperate attention of someone searching for proof that he could still feel anything at all would have noticed. He read all 3 letters. Then he placed them in his desk drawer, locked it, and sat in the dark for a very long time. And the silence that filled the study was not the silence of a man making a decision. It was the silence of a man standing at the exact center of a bridge that was burning from both ends, and the flames were close enough now to feel on his skin, and every direction was fire. Lucien did not sleep. He sat in the study until the candles burned to stubs and the gray light of a winter dawn crept through the windows like something ashamed to arrive. The forged letters lay in the locked drawer beneath his right hand, and his right hand had not moved from that drawer in 6 hours. Not because he was guarding the letters, because some part of him, some mechanism buried so deep it predated language, understood that the moment he opened that drawer again and reread those words, he would have to make a decision that would define everything that came after. And Lucien Blackthorn, for the first time in a decade, was not certain which decision would destroy him less. He had built his life on a single architectural principle: trust no one. Not because people were inherently malicious, though many were, but because trust required surrender, and surrender required vulnerability. And vulnerability in a man of his position was not a character flaw. It was an invitation to annihilation. Every alliance he maintained was transactional, every relationship calibrated for utility. Every human connection in his orbit existed within a framework of leverage and consequence that left no room for the catastrophic variable of genuine faith in another person. And then a woman he had married as a business acquisition had walked into his study, sat in his chair without permission, and handed him the truth. Not a version of it. Not a politically convenient approximation. The actual, verifiable, arithmetically irrefutable truth about what was happening inside his own walls. She had done this without allies, without resources, without any motivation he could identify beyond the raw, infuriating compulsion to see clearly in a place designed to keep everyone blind. Now 3 letters in his drawer told him she was a spy. His breathing was even. His posture had not changed. But somewhere behind his sternum, in the place where certainty used to live, there was a fissure. Hairline thin. Almost imperceptible. The kind of crack that appears in a dam long before the structure fails, and the water behind it does not care about the engineering, or the reinforcement, or the years of careful maintenance. The water only knows pressure, and pressure only knows forward. He opened the drawer. He read the letters again, slowly this time, not for content. He had memorized the content 6 hours ago. He read them for construction, for the weight of the language, the rhythm of the phrasing, the specific vocabulary choices that a person makes when they are writing naturally versus when they are assembling a performance. Lord Vale's actual correspondence, which Lucienne had studied before the marriage negotiations, favored short declarative sentences and a formal register that bordered on the archaic. These letters used longer constructions, subordinate clauses that meandered, a slightly more contemporary cadence that felt less like an aging nobleman dictating to a secretary and more like someone younger, someone sharper, someone who understood how Lord Vale sounded, but not quite how Lord Vale thought. He set the letters down. He did not reach a conclusion. Lucian Blackthorne did not reach conclusions the way other men did, through intuition or feeling or the accumulated weight of impression. He constructed them, brick by brick, evidence by evidence. And the construction was not yet complete because there were too many variables and not enough verified data points, and making a decision in that state was not caution. It was discipline. The discipline that had kept him alive through a father who beat obedience into him before he could read, through a mother who left before he could remember her face, through an inheritance that arrived wrapped in debts and vendettas, and the absolute certainty that every person who congratulated him on his ascension was already calculating how to profit from his inexperience. He stood. He crossed to the window. The sea below was the color of iron, churning against the cliffs with a persistence that was neither angry nor patient, but simply relentless. The way erosion is relentless, the way time is relentless, the way the slow accumulation of evidence eventually wears away even the most carefully maintained lies. He would not confront Seraphina. Not yet. He would watch. He would verify. And he would give Ashworth exactly enough rope to determine whether the man intended to climb with it or hang. By mid-morning, the castle had developed the particular tension that precedes institutional violence. The servants felt it first, the way animals feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm makes itself visible. Footmen moved through corridors with their eyes down. Kitchen staff spoke in whispers. Agnes, who had maintained her professional neutrality through 2 decades of Blackthorn service, dropped a tea tray for the first time in her career and spent 11 minutes on her hands and knees collecting porcelain shards with fingers that would not stop shaking. Seraphina noticed. She noticed everything now. Hypervigilance had become her default state, a permanent narrowing of attention that registered shifts in atmosphere the way a sailor registers shifts in wind. Something had changed overnight. The quality of the silence in the castle had altered, had become denser, more compressed, loaded with the kind of energy that precedes either an explosion or a collapse. Mr. Hargrove arrived at her dining hall at 10:30. He looked worse than usual. The permanent startlement that characterized his expression had deepened into something closer to terror, and his ink-stained fingers were wrapped around a folded piece of paper that he held against his chest, like a man clutching evidence that might cost him his life. "Close the door," Seraphina said. He closed it. He stood in the center of the vast room, dwarfed by the table and the empty chairs and the cavernous ceiling, and he looked like what he was. A small man carrying information too large for him. "I have the names you requested," he said. "The clerks who carried documents between Lord Ashworth's office and the Duke's study. But there is something else, Your Grace. Something I was not looking for." Seraphina set down her pen. "Tell me." Yesterday evening, a junior clerk named Whitfield delivered a folder to the Duke's study. The folder was marked Intercepted Correspondence. I asked Whitfield where the folder originated. He said Lord Ashworth gave it to him directly with instructions to place it on the Duke's desk. What was in it? Whitfield did not know, but I made an inquiry with the mail office. There has been no intercepted correspondence in the past month, no mail inspection, no flagged documents. Whatever was in that folder did not come through official channels. The information settled into Seraphina's mind the way a key settles into a lock. Click. The mechanism turned. The door opened. And behind it was a room she had suspected existed but had not yet been able to see. Ashworth was not merely embezzling, he was counterattacking. The man had received her evidence, understood the threat, and rather than retreat or negotiate or even accelerate his theft and flee, he had chosen to go on the offensive. Fabricated documents delivered directly to the Duke's desk. Documents designed not to exonerate Ashworth, but to incriminate someone else. To incriminate her. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. "Mr. Hargrove, I need to see the Duke. Immediately." Hargrove's terror visibly intensified. "Your Grace, The Duke has given orders that he is not to be disturbed. His instructions were explicit. No visitors, no correspondence, no interruptions of any kind. I do not care about his instructions. Your Grace, please. Hargrove's voice cracked. The sound was small and terrible. The sound of a man whose capacity for courage had been measured and found just barely sufficient for carrying a piece of paper across a castle, but profoundly insufficient for watching a Duchess march into the direct line of fire of a Duke who had locked himself in his tower. If Ashworth has done what I think he has done, going to the Duke now, before you can prove the fabrication, will only confirm whatever story those documents are telling. Seraphina stopped. Her hand was on the back of the chair. Her knuckles were white. She was breathing through her nose in controlled, deliberate pulls of air that sounded like a woman holding herself together through sheer mechanical discipline, and in the space between each breath was the particular silence of someone recalculating at tremendous speed. Hargrove was right. She hated that he was right. She hated it with a violence that surprised her because Seraphina Vale did not experience hatred casually. She experienced it the way she experienced everything, analytically, structurally, as a force to be understood and directed rather than indulged. But this hatred was different. This was personal. This was the white-hot fury of a woman who had done the right thing, who had brought the truth to a man too isolated to find it himself, and whose reward was to be framed as a traitor by the very people whose crimes she had exposed. "What do you suggest?" she asked. And the fact that she was asking a terrified account manager for strategic advice in a castle full of enemies told her everything she needed to know about how far she had fallen from any position of strength. Hargrove swallowed. "Proof, Your Grace. You need proof that the documents are forged before you confront the Duke. Without it, your word against Lord Ashworth's is a contest you cannot win. He has been trusted for years. You have been here for weeks. Where would that proof be? Lord Ashworth's private chambers, the real ledgers, the ones that do not match what he presents to the Duke. He keeps them in his quarters. Or he did. If he has moved them, there may still be drafts. Correspondence, something that shows the fabrication." Seraphina looked at him for a long time. In that look was the full weight of what she was about to ask of him and of herself. Breaking into the private chambers of a man who was actively conspiring to destroy her, in a castle where her husband had confined her to a single wing, where her only allies were an account manager and a servant who brought extra candles. The mathematics of this situation were brutal. The odds were worse. But the alternative was to sit in this dining hall with its 60 empty chairs and wait for the conspiracy to close around her like a fist. And Seraphina had decided on her first night in this castle that she would burn fear for fuel rather than let it consume her, and right now the fire needed to be very, very hot. "Tonight," she said, "after the household retires, can you get me access to the west corridor without being seen?" Hargrove closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. Not courage, exactly. Something quieter. Resignation, perhaps. The particular resignation of a man who has been invisible his entire life and has just realized that invisibility, in this specific moment, is not a weakness, but a weapon. "Yes, Your Grace, I can do that." The west corridor at midnight was a different country. The daytime castle, for all its coldness and austerity, at least had the presence of human activity. Footsteps. Voices. The distant clatter of the kitchen. At midnight, Ravenshade became something else entirely. A structure of pure silence and shadow, where the only sound was the wind against the windows and the distant rhythmic assault of the sea against the cliffs, and every doorway looked like a mouth that might speak or swallow, and you could not tell which until you stepped through. Seraphina moved through the corridor with her shoes in her hand, stockinged feet on cold stone, Hargrove's hand-drawn map folded inside her sleeve. She had memorized the route, left at the second landing, through the gallery, past the library, down the narrow servants' staircase that bypassed the main hall. Ashworth's chambers were on the third floor of the west tower, behind a door that Hargrove had described as typically unlocked, because Ashworth, like many men who believed their secrets were well hidden, relied on reputation rather than hardware for security. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open, stepped inside, and closed it behind her with a care so extreme that the latch engaging sounded like a whisper. The chambers were larger than she expected. A sitting room with a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly, casting just enough light to turn the room into a composition of shapes and shadows. A desk against the far wall, heavy with papers. A bureau in the corner. Bookshelves that held more ledgers than books. She went to the desk first, methodical, quick, fingers moving through papers with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent years managing her father's estate and understood that documents arrange themselves in layers, the most recent on top, the most damaging buried deep or hidden off-site. She found the drafts in the second drawer. 3 sheets of practice paper, crumpled and then smoothed flat, covered in attempts to replicate her father's handwriting. Lord Vale's distinctive script, the slightly left-leaning slant, the elongated S, the compressed vowels, reproduced over and over in varying degrees of accuracy. Beside them, a small jar of ink and a wooden stamp that, when she held it up to the dying firelight, revealed a near-perfect replica of the Vale family seal. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. From the pure distilled fury of holding in her hands the physical evidence that a man had sat at this desk and methodically manufactured the tools to destroy her. To take everything she had done, every number she had verified, every risk she had taken, and transform it into proof of a crime she had not committed. It was a violation so intimate, so precisely targeted, that it felt less like fraud and more like a form of violence. She took the drafts. She took a sample of the ink. She took a sheet of the stationery that matched the paper the forged letters would have been written on. She put everything inside her dress and turned to leave. The door opened before she reached it. Lord Ashworth stood in the doorway in his dressing gown, a candle in one hand, and for 3 seconds neither of them moved. 3 seconds that contained entire architectures of calculation, entire lifetimes of consequence, 3 seconds in which 2 people who understood the stakes with perfect clarity stared at each other across a distance of 8 feet and understood that what happened in the next moment would determine everything. Ashworth spoke first. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The gentleness of a man who has nothing left to lose and has discovered that the absence of hope produces a certain terrible calm. I wondered when you would come. Seraphina's back was straight. Her chin was level. The evidence was pressed against her ribs beneath her clothing, and she could feel the paper crinkling with each breath, and each breath was costing her more than the last. You forged letters to frame me. I protected myself. You are stealing from the Duke. I am surviving the Duke. There is a difference, Your Grace, though I would not expect someone who has been here 3 weeks to appreciate it. Ashworth stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was louder than it should have been, or perhaps every sound was louder now because Seraphina's body had shifted into the state where adrenaline sharpens everything, where colors become more vivid and sounds become more distinct, and time itself seems to slow because the brain, when it believes it may be running out of time, begins to pay closer attention to what remains. Lucian Blackthorne inherited this duchy at 22, Ashworth said. A boy with a dead father's debts and a dead father's enemies and absolutely no understanding of how the machinery actually worked. I built that machinery. I maintained it. I kept the estate solvent through 2 financial crises, 3 territorial disputes, and a succession challenge that would have destroyed anyone else. And my reward was the same as every other person who serves a Blackthorne. Suspicion, control. The permanent awareness that my position existed at the pleasure of a man who did not understand the concept of pleasure. So you decided to pay yourself. I decided to insure myself. The money I redirected was not greed. It was a contingency. A guarantee that when the Duke inevitably decided I had outlived my usefulness, I would have somewhere to go and something to live on. Every man at that table tonight, Pemberton, Hartwick, Fairfax, the Ashfords, they all made the same calculation. We did not conspire against Lucian Blackthorne. We adapted to him. The way organisms adapt to hostile environments, by developing mechanisms for survival that the environment was never designed to support. Seraphina listened, not because she agreed, not because the argument had merit, though it possessed the dangerous plausibility of all well-constructed rationalizations. She listened because Ashworth was talking, and while he talked, she was thinking, mapping exits, counting seconds, measuring the distance between where she stood and where she needed to be. "And the forged letters," she said. "Regrettable, but necessary." "You understand necessity, Your Grace. I watched you operate these past weeks. You did not investigate the estate finances because you were offended by corruption. You did it because you needed leverage, because you understood correctly that a woman with no power in this castle could only acquire power by making herself indispensable, and indispensability required information, and information required access, and access required risk. We are the same, you and I. We are both survivors operating inside a system that was built to crush us. We are not the same." "No?" He tilted his head. The candlelight caught his face at an angle that made his features look composed of competing intentions, half reasonable, half lethal. "Then what will you do with those papers pressed against your ribs? Take them to the Duke? Tell him his chief steward forged letters to frame his wife? And when he asks how you obtained this evidence, what will you say? That you broke into my chambers at midnight? That you violated the privacy of a senior member of his household? How will that look, Your Grace, to a man who already has 3 letters on his desk telling him that you are a spy for a rival house?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade suspended from a thread. Seraphina felt the weight of it, felt the truth of it, which was the worst part because Ashworth was not wrong about the optics. She had broken into his chambers, she was carrying stolen evidence, and the man she needed to convince of her innocence was the same man who had imprisoned her in a wing of his own castle because he fundamentally did not believe that any person could act without a hidden agenda. "Here is what I propose," Ashworth said. "You return those papers to my desk. You go back to your wing. You continue your meals in that lovely dining hall. And we proceed as though tonight never happened. The forged letters will do their work. The Duke will question your motives. Your influence will diminish. And in time, when the noise has settled, I will ensure that your position at Ravenshade is comfortable. Truly comfortable. Better quarters. More staff. A monthly allowance that reflects your station. In exchange, you stop investigating, and the machine continues to function as it has for 3 years." Seraphina stared at him. She held his gaze the way she had held Lucien's on her first night, not because it did not hurt, but because looking away would mean conceding something she refused to concede, something deeper than this conversation, something that lived at the foundation of who she was. "You're offering me a cage with nicer curtains. I'm offering you survival." "No, you're offering me complicity. And complicity is not survival, Lord Ashworth. It is a slower way of disappearing." She stepped forward, toward the door, toward him. The space between them compressed until she could smell the port on his breath, and the tallow from his candle, and the particular scent of a man who has not slept in 2 days and has been running on fear and ambition and the diminishing returns of his own cunning. "I will take my chances with the Duke." Ashworth did not move from the doorway. "You are making a mistake." "Perhaps. But it will be my mistake, not yours." She reached past him. Her hand found the door handle. He could have stopped her. She knew that. He was larger, stronger, and they were alone in his chambers at midnight in a castle where no one would hear and no one would come. But Ashworth did not stop her, because some final calculation in his strategic mind produced a result he did not expect. Not mercy, not decency. Recognition. The grudging, involuntary recognition that the woman standing in front of him had a quality he had encountered in only one other person in this castle, and that person was the Duke himself. The absolute, unshakable refusal to bend. She left. She walked the dark corridors with the evidence against her ribs and her shoes in her hand and her pulse pounding so loudly in her ears that it sounded like war drums, and when she reached the east wing and closed her door and leaned against it in the darkness, she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of pure, uncontrolled terror. Her body shook. Her vision blurred. Her knees buckled and she caught herself on the doorframe and breathed in gas that sounded like something tearing. Then she straightened. She lit a candle. She placed the stolen evidence on her dining table beside her notes. And she sat down and began to write. Not to her father, not to a solicitor. Not to any external authority who might take weeks to respond if they responded at all. She wrote to Lucy, a letter that contained no defense, no pleading, no emotional appeal to a man who had shown no capacity for emotional response. She wrote a clinical document, A forensic comparison of the forged letter's handwriting against her father's actual correspondence, which she had brought with her from home. A chemical analysis suggesting the ink used in the forgeries was commercially available in the southern provinces, but not in the northern region where her father's estate was located. A timeline proving that 2 of the 3 forged letters were dated on days when her father was documented to be in London for parliamentary business, making it physically impossible for him to have dispatched sealed correspondence from his country estate. She wrote until dawn painted the windows gray. She wrote until her hand cramped and the candle guttered, and the evidence spoke for itself in the language Lucien understood best. Not emotion, not loyalty, not the desperate assertion of innocence that guilty people deploy and innocent people should not have to. Numbers, dates, verifiable facts, the architecture of truth assembled with the same precision that Ashworth had used to construct his lies, except truth has a structural integrity that fabrication does not, and under sufficient scrutiny, the difference becomes undeniable. She sealed the letter. She gave it to Mr. Hargrove at first light with instructions to deliver it to the Duke's study personally, not through a clerk, not through a footman, not through any intermediary whose hands Ashworth might have already reached. And then she sat in the East Dining Hall and ate breakfast alone. 1 egg, 1 cup of tea, 60 empty chairs, waiting for the Duke to decide whether to trust the woman he had married to control or the men who had been controlling him for years. 3 floors above, Lucien Blackthorne received the letter. He broke the seal. He read it once, quickly. Then again, slowly. Then a third time, with the forged letters spread beside it on his desk, his eyes moving between the 2 documents with the systematic intensity of a man performing an autopsy on his own assumptions. The handwriting analysis was conclusive. The ink discrepancy was verifiable. The timeline was airtight. The letters accusing his wife were forgeries, which meant Ashworth had fabricated them, which meant Ashworth was not merely a thief. He was an enemy combatant operating inside the walls of the fortress, and he had weaponized the Duke's own psychology against him, had understood with surgical precision that Lucien's inability to trust was not a shield but a vulnerability, the most exploitable vulnerability in his entire architecture, because a man who trusts no one can be manipulated by anyone willing to feed that distrust. Lucien set both documents down. He placed his hands flat on the desk. He stared at the wall. And inside his chest, in the place where the fissure had formed the night before, something gave way. Not dramatically, not with the spectacular collapse that makes for good theater. Quietly. The way a wall gives way after years of pressure, not because the final blow was the hardest, but because it was the last. He had been wrong. Not about Ashworth. He could survive being wrong about Ashworth. Men betray. That was mechanical. Expected. The cost of operating in a world where self-interest was the universal currency. He had been wrong about her. He had taken a woman of extraordinary intelligence and moral precision and locked her in a dining hall with 1 egg and 1 cup of tea and treated her like a liability because his entire operating system, the code that had kept him alive and sane and in control since he was a boy, with bruises hidden beneath starched collars, classified every human being as a threat until proven otherwise, and the standard of proof was set so high that no one could ever meet it. The standard was designed to be unachievable. That was the point. That was the architecture. Isolation disguised as discernment, paranoia dressed up as strength, a fortress that kept everyone out and called the emptiness inside it safety. Seraphina had met the standard. She had met it in 3 weeks, without resources, without allies, without a single reason to help a man who had done nothing to deserve it. She had met it by doing the one thing his system could not account for. She had told the truth when lying would have been easier. Lucien stood up. He walked to the window. He looked down at the sea that had been throwing itself against his cliffs for centuries, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like stepping into cold water, that the fortress he had built around himself was not protecting him from his enemies. It was protecting his enemies from him. It was keeping him blind, keeping him isolated, keeping him exactly where Ashworth needed him to be. Controllable. Alone. Fed a steady diet of fabricated information by men who had turned his own walls into their hiding place. The realization was not liberating, it was devastating. because it meant that everything he had believed about strength, about control, about the absolute necessity of ruling alone was not wisdom. It was damage. It was the scar tissue left by a father who taught him that love was weakness, and a mother who confirmed it by leaving, and he had spent 30 years mistaking that scar tissue for armor. He could not fix this alone. The thought arrived in his mind with the force of something physically striking him. He could not audit the books alone. He could not identify every compromised agent alone. He could not root out a conspiracy that had been growing inside his walls for 3 years while he sat in this tower believing his solitude made him invulnerable. He needed her, not as an ornament, not as a title, not as a strategic acquisition to be stored in the East Wing and managed through deliberate deprivation. He needed Seraphina Vale the way a man drowning needs the hand reaching into the water, not because the hand is convenient, because the hand is the only thing between him and the dark. He crossed to his desk. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. He dipped his pen. And for the first time in his life, Lucian Blackthorne wrote something that was not an order, not a summons, not a decree backed by the implicit threat of consequence. He wrote a request. 2 lines. No embellishment, no preamble. I have read your evidence. I have read theirs. Come to the study. Not as Duchess, as yourself. He sealed it. He sent it. And then he sat behind his desk and waited. And the waiting was harder than anything he had ever done, because waiting required something that Lucian Blackthorne had spent a lifetime refusing to practice. It required trust. And 50 miles to the south, on a road that wound through frozen countryside toward the coastline where Ravenshade's cliffs met the sea, a carriage bearing no insignia and carrying no announced passengers moved at speed through the winter darkness. Inside sat Lord Pemberton, Lord Hartwick, and a man whose face neither of them had seen before. A man Ashworth had summoned from London with a single coded message. A man whose profession was not listed in any directory and whose services were paid for in cash and silence. The man had no name that mattered. He had a skill set, and the skill set had been purchased for a single purpose. The Duchess of Ravenshade was not meant to see another sunrise. Seraphina received the note at 9:15. She read it standing beside the dining table where she had spent the night assembling evidence, her body running on 4 hours of fractured sleep and the particular brand of energy that fear manufactures when rest is not an option. The handwriting was Lucian's. She had seen enough of his correspondence in the estate ledgers to recognize the sharp, angular script. The letters formed with the precision of a man who treated even penmanship as an exercise in control. I have read your evidence. I have read theirs. Come to the study. Not as Duchess, as yourself. She read it twice. The second time slower, pulling each word apart the way she would pull apart a financial entry, looking for what was hidden beneath the stated value. Not as Duchess, as yourself. 8 words that represented either a door opening or a trap closing, and she could not tell which because Lucian Blackthorne communicated in a frequency that did not distinguish between invitation and ambush. She folded the note. She pressed it flat against the table. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of the silver tea tray Agnes had left earlier and saw a woman she barely recognized. Eyes bruised with exhaustion. Hair pulled back in a utilitarian knot she had not bothered to style. The riding coat she had worn from her father's estate still hanging on the chair in the corner because she had not yet acquired enough clothing at Ravenshade to replace it. Because acquiring clothing required requesting it, and requesting required asking a man who had designed her existence here around the principle of strategic deprivation. She straightened her dress. She picked up the folder containing her evidence, and she walked out of the East Wing. The corridors between the East Wing and the central tower had never felt longer. Every footstep echoed in ways that sounded amplified, as though the castle itself was paying attention. She passed 2 servants who flattened themselves against the wall as she approached, their eyes down, their bodies communicating the instinctive deference of people who have learned that proximity to power is proximity to danger. She passed the portrait gallery where Lord Pemberton had stood examining dead Blackthorns with his performative admiration, and the gallery was empty now, the painted eyes following her with the indifferent gaze of ancestors who had survived their own conspiracies and felt no obligation to help with hers. She climbed the staircase. She reached the door. She knocked once. Enter. The study was different, not physically. The same windows, the same bookshelves, The same desk that could double as a fortification. But the air had changed. The temperature of the room had shifted in some way that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the grate and everything to do with the man behind the desk, who was standing when she entered. Standing. Lucien Blackthorne, who had not stood for her at their wedding, who had not stood when she first entered this room to present her findings, was on his feet. The gesture was small. It cost him nothing in physical terms. But Seraphina understood, with an instinct that bypassed analysis entirely, that for this man, in this room, the act of standing when she walked in was the closest thing to a concession his architecture would permit. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He did not sit. Neither did she. They stood on opposite sides of the desk like opposing generals studying a shared map, except the territory between them was not geographical. It was the accumulated distance of 3 weeks of silence, isolation, power games, and the slow, grinding revelation that neither of them was what the other had expected. Lucien spoke first. "The letters accusing you of conspiring with your father's house are forgeries. I have verified this independently of your analysis, though your analysis was—" He paused, and the pause contained something she had never heard in his voice before, a fractional hesitation that in another man would have been unremarkable, but in Lucien Blackthorne constituted a seismic event. Thorough. "I know they are forgeries. I found the drafts in Ashworth's chambers." His jaw tightened. "You entered his chambers." "I did." "Alone. At night. Without authorization. Without protection. In a castle where the man whose quarters you violated has been stealing from me for 3 years and has demonstrated a willingness to fabricate evidence to eliminate threats." "That is an accurate summary, yes." Something moved through his expression. Not anger. She had seen his anger. It was cold and mechanical and operated behind a screen of total composure. This was different. This was rawer. This was the look of a man confronting the image of something that had almost happened and finding the image intolerable. "That was reckless," he said. And the word came out harder than he intended. She could hear it. The force behind it was disproportionate to the statement, as though the word was carrying weight that belonged to other words, words he did not have the vocabulary for or the practice to deliver. "It was necessary. It was dangerous. Everything in this castle is dangerous, Your Grace. You designed it that way." The silence that followed had edges. It cut into the space between them and left both of them aware that something fundamental was being renegotiated, not through diplomacy or leverage or the careful exchange of strategic concessions, but through the raw, ungovernable fact that two people who had been operating as adversaries were standing in the same room holding the same evidence against the same enemy and could no longer pretend that the distance between them was functional. Lucien moved first. He walked around the desk. Not toward her, past her, to the window where the sea churned below the cliffs in its eternal assault on the rock. He stood with his back to her, and the posture was so uncharacteristic, so profoundly at odds with a man who never turned his back on anyone, that Seraphina felt the significance of it in her chest like a change in pressure. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the authority that usually armored it. What remained was something leaner, something closer to the actual man beneath the title, and it sounded like gravel that had been worn smooth by water that never stopped moving. "I confined you to the East Wing. I reduced your household to 3 servants. I designed your daily existence to communicate a single message, that you were irrelevant, that your presence here was tolerated rather than valued, that your function in this marriage was to be managed rather than consulted. And while I was doing this, while I was treating you as a variable to be controlled, you were the only person in my entire operation who was looking at the truth." He turned from the window. His gray eyes found hers, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ravenshade, they were not performing an assessment. They were doing something infinitely more difficult. They were seeing. "I will not apologize. Apologies are currency spent to purchase absolution, and absolution requires a transaction I am not interested in. What I will tell you is this. Ashworth has been embezzling from the estate for 3 years. He has forged documents, corrupted allies, and attempted to destroy the one person who identified the rot. He has allies. Pemberton, Hartwick, Fairfax, the Ashford brothers. Their names appear in the ledgers and in intelligence my own guards have gathered in the past 12 hours. I intend to dismantle them, all of them, publicly, permanently." He paused. His hands were at his sides. His fingers were not fisted. They were open. The most deliberately vulnerable posture she had seen from him. "I am asking for your help." Seraphina looked at him for a long time. She looked at the man who had designed her isolation with the same attention to detail he applied to everything. The man who had sat at this desk and read, forged letters accusing her of treason, and had not immediately believed them, which she understood now was not a small thing. For Lucienne Blackthorne, whose default setting was suspicion, the act of not believing an accusation was an act of staggering deviation from his own programming. He had doubted the letters. He had verified. He had allowed for the possibility that the woman he married was not an enemy. For this man, that was as close to faith as physics would allow. "I will help you," she said. "But not from the East Wing. Not with 3 servants and 1 egg and a tea service designed to remind me every morning that I am here on sufferance. If you want my mind, you give me access, full access, the treasury, the correspondence archives, the staff records, the intelligence your guards have gathered, everything. That is unprecedented. So is what Ashworth did to your estate. Unprecedented problems require unprecedented responses. You know this. You have always known it. You simply preferred the illusion of control to the reality of collaboration." The words landed. She watched them land. She watched Lucien absorb them the way his cliffs absorb the sea, not by resisting the impact, but by being composed of something too dense to erode. "Done," he said. One word. No negotiation, no conditions, no clauses or caveats or the elaborate qualifications that powerful men attach to concessions to ensure they still feel like commands. Just done. Like a lock turning, like a wall coming down. They worked through the morning. Side by side at his desk, the estate's financial architecture spread between them like an autopsy of a body that had been dying for years while the doctors lied about its health. Seraphina cross-referenced the corrupted accounts with legitimate records, building a map of the conspiracy that grew more comprehensive and more damning with every hour. Lucien reviewed the intelligence reports from his guards, identifying which members of the household staff had been compromised, which communication channels Ashworth controlled, which physical locations within the estate were being used for covert meetings. By noon, they had a complete picture. The conspiracy was larger than either of them had estimated. Not 5 men, 12. Not just financial embezzlement, but systematic infiltration of the estate's administrative structure, its legal affairs, its external trade relationships. Ashworth had not merely been stealing money. He had been building a parallel government inside Ravenshade's walls, a shadow administration that answered to him rather than the Duke, funded by the Duke's own wealth, protected by the Duke's own isolation. Lucien studied the completed map with an expression that Seraphina could only describe as geological. Something was shifting beneath the surface of his composure, tectonic plates of assumption grinding against newly verified reality, producing pressure that had nowhere to go except forward. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will summon them all. A formal council meeting. Every man whose name appears in these documents. They will come because refusing a ducal summons is an act of defiance they cannot yet afford. And when they are assembled, I will present the evidence. All of it. Publicly. Irrefutably. Ashworth will anticipate this. He has had time to prepare countermeasures. Ashworth has had time to panic. There is a difference. Preparation requires clarity. Panic produces mistakes. And the mistakes are already accumulating." He tapped a section of the intelligence report. "His private ledgers are missing from the estate. He moved them the night he received the warning that you had found the discrepancies. My guards tracked the transfer. A satchel was carried to the hunting lodge south of the grounds and locked in a strongbox. The lodge is now under surveillance." "You knew about the lodge. I know about everything that happens on my land. What I did not know, until you showed me, was what to look for." The afternoon brought something neither of them expected. A messenger arrived from the south gate at 3:30, breathless, his horse lathered despite the cold. The message was from Lucien's perimeter guard, a network of men stationed at intervals along the roads leading to the estate, men whose job was to monitor arrivals and report anything that deviated from expected patterns. A carriage had been spotted on the southern road, unmarked, moving at speed. 3 passengers. The guard had recognized Lord Pemberton through the window. The second passenger matched the description of Lord Hartwick. The third was unknown. Lucien read the report. His expression did not change, but his body altered in a way that Seraphina registered with the heightened perception of someone who had spent 3 weeks learning to read this man the way she read ledgers, looking for the entries that did not match. His shoulders shifted, his weight redistributed, his center of gravity lowered by a fraction, the unconscious physical preparation of a man whose body was older than his title and remembered threats that his rational mind had categorized and filed. "They are not coming for a council meeting," Seraphina said. "No." The third passenger. Lucien folded the report with precise, deliberate movements. "An insurance policy. Ashworth is not a violent man by nature, but desperation recalibrates nature. When the numbers stop working, when the forgeries fail, when the political maneuvering reaches its terminal point, men like Ashworth do not surrender. They escalate. They find someone willing to do the thing they cannot do themselves and pay them enough to make the moral question irrelevant." Who is the third passenger? "Someone who solves problems that cannot be solved through negotiation." He looked at her, and his eyes held something she had not seen before. Not fear. Lucien Blackthorne did not experience fear in any form she would recognize, but concern. A focused, specific concern directed at her with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "You are the problem they need solved." The words settled into her body like cold water. Not gradually, all at once. She felt them in her stomach, in her spine, in the sudden acceleration of her pulse that she controlled through the same mechanical discipline she had been applying since her first night in this castle. Fear as fuel, fear as resource. Fear burned for warmth, not consumed. "What do we do?" she asked, and the "we" came out naturally, without thought, without the calculated deployment of inclusive language designed to signal alliance. It was instinctive. 2 people standing in the same room looking at the same threat and understanding, at a level deeper than strategy, that the only way through was together. Lucien moved to the door. He opened it. He spoke to the guard stationed in the corridor with a series of commands so rapid, so precisely structured, so loaded with specific tactical information that Seraphina realized she was hearing a man who had been trained for this. Not the politics, not the financial warfare. This, the actual physical defense of a position against people who intended to do harm. The Duke of Ravenshade had been educated in warfare, and the education was not theoretical. Secure the east and west gates. Double the perimeter watch on the south approach. Recall the tower guard to interior positions. I want 4 men in the central corridor, 2 at the base of this staircase, an armed response stationed in the great hall. Move the household staff to the servants' quarters and lock the external doors. No one enters or exits this castle without my direct authorization. This is effective immediately." The guard saluted and ran. His footsteps on the stone staircase sounded like a countdown. Lucien turned back to Seraphina. "You stay in this study. This room has 1 entrance, stone walls, and a line of sight to every approach. You do not leave it. And you? I am going to have a conversation with Lord Ashworth." Lucien. It was the first time she had used his name, not his title, not your grace. His name. It came out of her mouth before the filters could catch it, propelled by something that was not strategy and not calculation, and not the careful, disciplined management of every word that had characterized her survival in this castle. It was raw. It was involuntary. It was the sound a person makes when they care about the outcome more than the protocol. He stopped at the door. He did not turn fully. He turned his head just enough that his profile was visible, the sharp line of his jaw, the set of his mouth, the gray eye that caught the light from the window and held it. "I have survived everything this duchy has thrown at me since I was 22 years old," he said. His voice was low, not soft. Lucien Blackthorne did not do soft, but low in the register where truth lives when a man has stripped away everything except the load-bearing structures of who he actually is. I survived a father who considered brutality an educational tool. I survived inheritors who wanted me dead before the ink on my title dried. I survived 3 years of systematic theft by men I employed and compensated and trusted as far as my capacity for trust would stretch. I survived all of it by being alone, by making solitude into armor and control into a weapon and refusing to need anyone for anything ever. He paused. His hand was on the doorframe, his knuckles were white. That approach is no longer operational. The armor has been compromised. The weapon has been turned against me. The solitude I thought was protecting me was the very thing that made me blind. So I am walking down those stairs, and I am confronting a man who has been bleeding my estate dry, and who has just imported someone to kill my wife, and I am doing it not because I am unafraid, but because I have spent my entire life being afraid of the wrong things. He looked at her then, full face, no angle, no profile. The complete unshielded expression of Lucienne Blackthorne with every wall lowered and every defense temporarily offline, and what she saw was not the Duke, not the tyrant, not the cold machinery of power and possession that the world believed him to be. She saw the man, the actual man, damaged and brilliant and terrified and furious and alive in a way that he had not permitted himself to be alive in decades. A man who had just discovered that the most dangerous thing he had ever done was not confronting enemies or defending territory or navigating the lethal politics of aristocratic warfare. The most dangerous thing he had ever done was standing in a room with a woman who saw him clearly and choosing not to hide. "Stay in this room," he said. "I will come back." "You had better." The ghost of something crossed his face, not a smile. Lucienne Blackthorne did not smile, but the architecture of a smile, the foundation upon which a smile might someday be built, if the man who owned that face ever gave himself permission to construct one. He left. The door closed. His footsteps descended the staircase with the measured, deliberate rhythm of a man walking towards something he could not walk away from. Seraphina stood alone in the study. The sea was visible through the windows, gray and violent, throwing itself against the cliffs with the same relentless persistence it had maintained for centuries. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She breathed, and she waited. 30 minutes later, the castle erupted. The sound reached her first. Not a single event, but a cascade, a domino sequence of noises that told a story through acoustics alone. Shouting from the ground floor, the heavy crash of furniture being overturned, running footsteps, multiple sets, converging from different directions. Then a sound she had never heard inside these walls. A sound that turned her blood to something colder than the winter air pressing against the windows. Steel against steel. The unmistakable ring of blades meeting in a space that was not designed for combat, but had just become a battlefield. She moved to the window. Below, in the courtyard, the unmarked carriage stood empty. Its horses were still in harness, stamping and blowing steam into the frozen air. 2 of Lucien's guards lay on the cobblestones. Not dead, she told herself, though the evidence was ambiguous at this distance. Incapacitated, overwhelmed. The south gate was open, and through it she could see more figures moving, dark shapes against the gray stone, converging on the castle's main entrance with the coordinated efficiency of men who had rehearsed this. Not a meeting, not a negotiation, an assault. She turned from the window. Her heart was hammering. Not the controlled, disciplined pulse she had maintained through weeks of isolation and investigation. This was biological. This was the body overriding the mind, flooding her system with chemicals designed for a world where threats were physical, and survival was measured in seconds rather than strategies. The study door was the only entrance. Stone walls, one way in, one way out. Lucienne had chosen this room because it was defensible. But defensible meant nothing if the man who was supposed to defend it was 3 floors below in the middle of a fight that sounded, from the escalating chaos of its acoustics, like it was growing. She picked up the heaviest object within reach, a brass candlestick from the mantelpiece. It was absurd. A duchess holding a candlestick in a fortified study while a conspiracy tore itself apart beneath her feet. It was absurd, and it was real, and it was the only option available. And Seraphina had learned in this castle that the only options available are the only options that matter. The sounds below intensified. More voices. Lucienne's among them, she was certain, though at this distance and through stone walls she could not make out words, only the timbre, The particular frequency of a voice she had learned to read the way sailors read weather. And the frequency was not controlled. It was not the measured, compressed authority she had heard in every previous interaction. It was unleashed. Full volume. The sound of a man who had removed every governor from every engine and was running at a capacity that the people around him had never witnessed and were not prepared for. Then silence. Not gradual silence. Not the slow diminishment of conflict resolving itself through exhaustion or surrender. Instant silence. The kind that falls when something decisive has happened. When a single moment has altered the equation so completely that every person in the room needs a second to recalibrate. Footsteps on the staircase. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming up. Seraphina raised the candlestick. Her grip was steady. Her breathing was not. The door opened. Lucien stood in the doorway. His black coat was torn at the shoulder. A line of blood ran from a cut above his left eyebrow, tracking down the side of his face in a dark streak that made his gray eyes look lighter, almost silver, almost incandescent against the crimson. His knuckles were split. His breathing was ragged, the first time she had heard him breathe in any way that was not perfectly controlled. And the sound of it, the raw animal labor of it, was somehow more intimate than anything that had passed between them. He looked at her. He looked at the candlestick. "Were you going to fight them with that?" he asked. His voice was wrecked, hoarse, shredded by whatever he had been shouting in the rooms below. "If I had to." Something broke in his expression. Not composure. He had lost composure somewhere on the staircase, something deeper, something structural. A wall that had been standing since he was a boy with bruises hidden beneath starched collars, a wall so old and so fundamental that it had become indistinguishable from his personality, a wall he had believed was him. It fell. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He took the candlestick from her hand and set it on the desk, and then he stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the iron of his blood and the cold stone of the corridors he had just fought through, and something underneath both, something warm, something human, something that had been locked away for so long it had almost forgotten how to exist. "Ashworth is in custody. Pemberton and Hartwick were intercepted in the west corridor. The man they brought with them is restrained in the Great Hall." He was speaking rapidly, factually, reporting. Because reporting was the language he knew, the syntax of control and information that had governed every interaction of his adult life. But his hands were shaking. His hands that had just fought their way through armed men were shaking, and not from the fight. From this. From standing this close to someone and not retreating. "The Great Hall is damaged, furniture destroyed. 3 of my guards are injured. Ashworth's hired man had a blade and knew how to use it. I disarmed him." He paused. "He cut me first." Seraphina reached up, slowly, giving him time to withdraw, to flinch, to engage the defensive reflexes that had governed his existence for 3 decades. Her fingers touched the cut above his eyebrow, lightly. The contact lasted 2 seconds. Lucien closed his eyes. The gesture was so small, so brief, and yet it detonated something inside the study that neither of them could take back. Because Lucien Blackthorne had closed his eyes, had voluntarily relinquished visual contact with his environment in the presence of another person, had for 2 seconds trusted someone enough to stop watching. When he opened his eyes, they were different, not softer. Lucien's eyes would never be soft, but clearer, as though a pane of smoked glass that had been installed between his interior and the outside world had been removed, and what was visible through the gap was not the Duke of Ravenshade, but the man who had been locked inside the Duke for 30 years, looking out. "It is not over," he said. "The council meeting happens tomorrow. Every conspirator who was not in this castle tonight will be summoned. The evidence will be presented, publicly, and I will need you beside me, not behind me, not in the East Wing, beside me. I will be there. There will be consequences, political fallout, enemies who survive the purge and carry grudges. The aristocracy does not forgive public humiliation. We will be building something new on the ashes of something old, and the old guard will fight us for every inch. I know. I am not an easy man. I know that too. I will make mistakes. I will revert to instinct. I will default to control and isolation and the cold machinery that has kept me functioning for decades, because reprogramming 30 years of survival strategy does not happen in an afternoon. Lucien. What? Stop listing your deficiencies and let me see the cut. He stared at her. And then something happened to his face that his face had clearly not practiced, had clearly not been briefed on, had clearly received no advance preparation for. The muscles around his eyes shifted, the corners of his mouth moved. Not far. Not into anything that the world would recognize as warmth, but enough. Enough that Seraphina, standing 6 inches from the most formidable man she had ever met, watching him bleed from a wound sustained defending her life, understood that she was witnessing something no one had witnessed in possibly 20 years. Lucian Blackthorne was trying to smile. 2 floors below, in the great hall of Ravenshade Castle, surrounded by overturned tables and shattered glass and the blood of men who had chosen the wrong side, Lord Ashworth sat in chains and stared at the ceiling and calculated. He was beaten. He knew he was beaten. But Ashworth was a man who had built his entire career on the principle that a game is not over until every piece is off the board, and he still had 1 piece left. 1 piece that no one in this castle knew about. 1 piece that was not in the Great Hall or the West Corridor or the Hunting Lodge. 1 piece that had been positioned 6 months ago, quietly, carefully, embedded so deeply into the infrastructure of the duchy that even the Duke's perimeter guards had not identified it. A piece that was, at this very moment, standing in the central treasury of Ravenshade Castle, alone, with a torch in one hand and 3 years of financial evidence stacked in wooden shelves around him like kindling. And the torch was already lit. The smell reached them before the sound did. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of a fireplace or the sharp tang of a kitchen hearth, but something thicker, something chemical and ancient, the smell of old paper and treated leather, and decades of stored records catching fire in a space not designed for combustion. It crept under the study door like a living thing, and Lucien's head snapped toward it with the instantaneous recognition of a man whose ancestors had built this fortress from stone, specifically because stone does not burn, but everything inside it does. The treasury, he said. Not a question. A diagnosis. His body was already moving, already recalibrating from the posture of a man who had just allowed himself 2 seconds of vulnerability back into the posture of a man who understood that vulnerability was a luxury this particular moment could not afford. The cut above his eye was still bleeding. His knuckles were still split. None of it registered. When the house is burning, you do not inventory your bruises. Seraphina was behind him on the staircase before he could tell her to stay. He heard her footsteps. He did not order her back. The part of him that would have issued that order an hour ago. The part that classified protection as control and control as dominance and dominance as the only functional expression of concern, that part had been dismantled somewhere between the fight in the Great Hall and the moment she touched the cut on his face and he closed his eyes. He could not rebuild it. Not now. Possibly not ever. And the absence of it, the raw, unshielded space where that machinery used to operate, felt less like weakness than he had spent 30 years believing it would. They hit the ground floor corridor at a run. The smoke was denser here, pooling along the ceiling in gray layers that stratified like geological formations, the oldest and thickest at the top, the newest still rising. 2 guards converged from the east passage, their faces sheeted with sweat, reporting in fragments. Fire in the central treasury. The iron door was locked from inside. Someone was in there. Lucien did not slow down. He moved through the corridors of his own castle with the certainty of a man who had memorized every passage, every door, every structural weakness in the walls he had inherited, because knowing your fortress was the first lesson his father had beaten into him, and it was one of the only lessons worth keeping. The treasury was in the heart of the castle, below the Great Hall, accessed through a reinforced corridor that had been designed 3 centuries ago to be impenetrable from the outside. The irony was precise and vicious. The room built to protect the estate's most valuable records was now the room incinerating them, and the door built to keep intruders out was keeping the fire in. He reached the treasury corridor. The iron door at its end was glowing faintly at the edges, heat turning the metal into a thermal signature that pulsed like a heartbeat. Smoke poured from the gap beneath the door in a continuous stream that hugged the floor and rose and made the air taste like the death of evidence. "Break it down," Lucian said. "Your Grace, the heat. Break it down." 2 guards with a timber beam. The first impact shuddered through the corridor like a detonation. The second buckled the hinges. The third blew the door inward, and what came out was a wall of heat so intense that Seraphina, standing 15 feet back, felt it on her face like an open hand. The treasury was an inferno. Shelves that had held decades of estate records, financial ledgers, legal decrees, land titles, correspondence archives, the entire documentary history of the Duchy of Ravenshade were burning. The flames had already consumed the western wall entirely. Orange and gold and a vicious chemical blue where the treated leather of the bindings caught and accelerated the destruction. Wooden filing cabinets had collapsed into themselves, their contents feeding a fire that had moved past the point of containment and into the territory of pure consumption. In the center of the room, on his knees, was a man Lucien did not recognize. Young, thin, unremarkable in every way that a person can be unremarkable when their function is to be invisible until activated. The torch he had used to start the fire lay on the stone floor beside him, spent. His work was done. 3 years of evidence, the documentation that would have proven the conspiracy beyond any possibility of denial, was becoming ash. The man looked up when the door came down. His face was blank. Not defiant. Not afraid. Professional. The expression of someone who had completed a contracted task and felt about it the way a carpenter feels about a finished shelf. The flames reflected in his eyes, and the reflection looked like nothing, like a man watching weather. 2 guards dragged him out. He did not resist. There was nothing left to resist for. The treasury burned for another 40 minutes before the castle's fire brigade, a team of servants and groundsmen trained for exactly this contingency, managed to suppress it with sand and water hauled from the lower cisterns. By the time the flames died, the western wall of the treasury was a ruin of charred wood and blackened stone, and the evidence that had been stored there was gone. Reduced to ash so fine it moved in the air like gray snow, settling on everything, on the floor, on the guards' uniforms, on Lucien's torn coat, on Seraphina's hands when she pressed them against the corridor wall to steady herself. Lucien stood in the doorway of the destroyed treasury and looked at what was left, which was very little. Charred remnants of shelving, the twisted iron skeleton of a filing cabinet, a few fragments of parchment that had survived at the edges of the room, singed and partial, containing pieces of words that no longer connected to complete thoughts. He stood there for a long time. The guards waited at a distance. Seraphina waited beside him. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full of the particular weight that accumulates when a man surveys damage that cannot be undone and must decide, in the space between what was lost and what remains, who he is going to be next. "They burned the proof," Seraphina said finally. Her voice was steady, quieter than usual. The steadiness of someone who is holding something together through will alone and knows that will has a shelf life. "They burned paper." Lucien's voice was raw, smoke-damaged. But underneath the rawness, something hard. Something that was not despair, though despair was certainly present, circling the edges of his composure like wolves circling a fire. Something denser. Paper is a record. It is not the truth. The truth exists independently of its documentation. The truth is in the contracts I will void by ducal authority, in the accounts I will freeze by executive order, in the testimony of every clerk and servant and tenant farmer who watched these men operate for 3 years and said nothing because silence was safer than speech. He turned from the doorway. His gray eyes found hers, and they were burning with something that was not the reflected fire. Ashworth wanted to destroy the evidence. What he destroyed was the easy path, the path that allowed me to prove the conspiracy without exposing the full scope of the rot, without showing the world exactly how deeply the infection went and exactly how blind I was to it. He thought destroying the evidence would protect him. What he did was eliminate the option of a quiet resolution. There is no quiet resolution now. There is only the public one, the total one, the kind that leaves nothing standing and requires everything to be rebuilt. He walked away from the treasury. Seraphina followed. They climbed the stairs together, through corridors that smelled of smoke and violence and the aftermath of a night that had fundamentally altered the architecture of everything. And when they reached the study, Lucien sat down at his desk and began to write. Not a letter, not a summons. A decree. The ducal decree was issued at dawn. It was delivered simultaneously to every noble household within the Ravenshade territories by mounted couriers who had been dispatched before first light. The decree was unprecedented in the history of the duchy. It dissolved the entire advisory council. It revoked the administrative privileges of every appointed steward, financial officer, and territorial agent. It froze all estate accounts pending a full independent audit. It declared Lord Ashworth, Lord Pemberton, Lord Hartwick, Sir Edmund Fairfax, Gerald Ashford, and Marcus Ashford formally accused of conspiracy, embezzlement, forgery, and attempted assassination. And it named Seraphina Blackthorne, Duchess of Ravenshade, as co-administrator of the duchy with full authority over financial affairs, estate management, and legal proceedings. Her word, the decree stated, carried the weight of the Duke's own authority. She spoke for Ravenshade. She decided for Ravenshade. Challenging her decisions was equivalent to challenging the Duke himself, and the Duke's position on being challenged was well established and involved consequences that the decree did not need to specify, because everyone in the duchy already understood. The Great Hall of Ravenshade Castle was repaired in 3 days. The broken furniture was removed. The bloodstains were scrubbed from the stone. New tables were brought in. And on the morning of the 4th day, the formal proceedings began. Lucien presided from the head of the hall. Seraphina sat to his right, not behind him, not below him, beside him. The positioning was deliberate, and its message was nuclear. Every noble, every tenant representative, every clerk and servant summoned to witness the proceedings understood instantly that the power structure of Ravenshade had undergone a seismic realignment, and the woman sitting at the Duke's right hand was not decoration. She was architecture. Ashworth was brought in first. He had been held in the castle's lower cells for 3 days, and the experience had done to his appearance what his years of embezzlement had done to the estate's finances. Stripped it of its false surface. Removed the polish, left the actual structure exposed, and the actual structure was smaller, weaker, more desperate than the facade had suggested. He stood before the Duke in chains and looked not at Lucien but at Seraphina, and in his eyes was the particular expression of a man who had gambled everything on the assumption that a woman confined to the East Wing with 3 servants and a tea service could not possibly matter, and had lost. Lord Ashworth, Lucien's voice filled the hall. It was not raised. It did not need to be. The acoustics of the room had been designed by architects who understood that a duke's voice should carry by virtue of the space itself, not by volume. You are charged with systematic theft of ducal revenues spanning 3 years. You are charged with the forgery of correspondence intended to frame the Duchess of Ravenshade as a conspirator against this house. You are charged with the procurement of an assassin for the purpose of eliminating the Duchess. And you are charged with the destruction of the central treasury and the records contained therein in an attempt to eliminate evidence of your crimes. How do you answer? Ashworth's jaw worked. The muscles in his face performed a sequence of adjustments that traced the path of a man cycling through his remaining options and finding each one empty. Denial required evidence to contradict, and the evidence was ash. Justification required an audience sympathetic to his perspective, and the audience in this hall was composed of people he had stolen from, lied to, and endangered. Appeal to the Duke's mercy required the Duke to possess mercy, and while Lucien Blackthorne possessed many qualities, mercy had never been identified among them. I answer, Ashworth said, and his voice was thin, stripped of the confident authority that had sustained it for years, that this duchy was a failing enterprise when I assumed stewardship of its finances. That the wealth I redirected was invested in maintaining alliances and relationships that kept Ravenshade functional during periods when the Duke's own policies of isolation and control were actively destroying the estate's ability to operate. I answer that I served this house for 15 years, and the reward for that service was the same paranoid surveillance and emotional deprivation that every person in this Duke's orbit receives. I did what I did to survive, and I am not the only one in this room who compromised their principles to survive Lucien Blackthorne. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that follows a detonation, when the sound is past and what remains is the ringing absence where the sound used to be. Ashworth's words hung in the air, and they had the specific gravity of statements that contain enough truth to be dangerous even when the speaker has no right to deliver them. Lucien did not flinch. He sat in his chair with the absolute stillness of a man who has been hit and is choosing not to show it. But Seraphina, sitting close enough to read the language of his body the way she had read his ledgers, saw the impact, saw it in the microscopic tightening of his hands on the arms of the chair, in the single, barely perceptible contraction of the muscle at the hinge of his jaw. Ashworth's accusation had found its target, not because it was fair, not because it was proportionate, because it was partially true. And partial truths are the most dangerous weapons in any arsenal because they cannot be entirely deflected. Your characterization of this house's failings is noted, Lucien said. Your service is noted. Your theft of £140,000 over 3 years is also noted, as is the attempted murder of my wife. The duchy's failings are mine to answer for. Your crimes are yours. He turned to the assembled hall. The accused is stripped of all titles, lands, and holdings within Ravenshade territories. His property is seized and liquidated. The proceeds are allocated to the restitution fund for affected tenants and staff. He will be transferred to the county magistrate for criminal proceedings. The same penalties apply to Lord Pemberton, Lord Hartwick, Sir Edmund Fairfax, Gerald Ashford, and Marcus Ashford. This is not negotiable. This is not subject to appeal. This is done. Ashworth was removed from the hall. Pemberton, Hartwick, and the others followed. Each face told its own version of the same story. The story of men who had mistaken a duke's isolation for ignorance and a duchess's confinement for irrelevance and had been proven catastrophically wrong about both. The proceedings lasted 3 more hours. Financial restructuring, appointment of new administrators, protocols for independent auditing, compensation orders for tenants whose revenues had been stolen. Each decision was delivered jointly, Lucien providing the authority and Seraphina providing the forensic precision that transformed authority into action. They worked together the way 2 instruments in an orchestra work together, not in unison but in harmony, each providing what the other lacked, each strengthened by the other's presence in ways that neither could have predicted and neither would have believed possible 4 weeks earlier. By late afternoon, the hall was empty. The proceedings were complete. The old order was gone. And Ravenshade was a duchy that, for the first time in its modern history, did not operate through a single point of authority, but through a partnership. Lucien found Seraphina in the east dining hall that evening. She was sitting at the long table, not eating, just sitting, her hands flat on the wood surface, staring at the 60 empty chairs with an expression that he could not read from the doorway. He walked in. His footsteps echoed in the vast room the way they always did, the acoustic signature of one person in a space built for dozens. Except now there were 2 people, and the echo sounded different. Warmer, not full, not yet, but no longer hollow. He sat across from her, not at the head of the table, not at the position of authority, directly across, eye level, the geometry of equals. You are sitting in the dining hall I used to punish you, he said. I know. It was designed to make you feel small. It did. For the first 3 days. Then it became a workspace. Then an operations center. Then the place where I dismantled your chief steward's criminal empire using a tea tray as a paperweight. She looked at him. The exhaustion in her face had settled into something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The way a landscape looks after a storm has passed and the damage is visible, but the sky is clear. It is the room where I understood what this castle actually was. And what is that? A monument to your loneliness. Every room in this fortress was built to ensure that whoever entered it felt the distance between themselves and you. The high ceilings, the vast tables, the corridors designed for echo. You constructed an environment where proximity was impossible because proximity required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing your architecture could not accommodate. She paused. You built a kingdom-sized version of the space between a boy and a father who hurt him, and then you lived inside it for decades and called it strength. The words landed in the silence of the dining hall with the precision of thrown knives, each one hitting its mark, each one drawing something that was not blood, but was just as essential, just as visceral, just as necessary to release. Lucien sat very still. His gray eyes were fixed on hers, and what was happening behind them was not calculation. It was not assessment. It was reckoning. The private, ungovernable process of a man hearing his own story told by someone who understood it well enough to tell it without flinching and recognizing, in the shape of her words, a truth he had spent his entire life building walls to avoid. "You are not wrong," he said, and the admission cost him something physical. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped by a fraction, as though the musculature that had been holding them at attention for 30 years had received, for the first time, permission to rest. "I inherited a name, a fortune, a title, a set of enemies, and a father's operating manual that consisted of a single instruction: need no one, trust no one, allow no one close enough to damage you. I followed that instruction with the same discipline I applied to everything else. Perfectly. Completely. And the result was a duchy being dismembered by the very men I relied on because I had made myself too isolated to see what they were doing." He leaned forward, his forearms on the table. The cut above his eye had been cleaned and closed with thin strips of adhesive, but the bruise beneath it was darkening, turning the skin around his left eye into a watercolor of purple and black that made him look less like a duke and more like a man who had recently been in a fight, which he had. "You asked me on the first night what I actually wanted from this marriage. I did not answer. I told you to learn to live with disappointment. The truth was that I did not know. I knew what I wanted from the transaction: your family's shipping routes, your ports, access to southern trade channels. I knew the strategic value down to the last decimal point. What I did not know, what I could not have known, because my operating system did not contain the variable, was that the woman attached to the transaction would be the single most consequential presence to enter this castle since I took possession of it." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. Hands that had fought. Hands that had written decrees. Hands that had trembled earlier that day for the first time he could remember since childhood. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I know how to command. I know how to investigate, negotiate, dismantle, and rebuild. I know how to read a financial document and identify fraud in 6 seconds. I know how to defend a castle and crush a conspiracy and project authority into a room of hostile aristocrats until every one of them remembers why they should be afraid of me. I do not know how to be in a room with one person and not make them afraid. I do not know how to need someone without categorizing that need as a tactical liability. I do not know how to want something that I cannot acquire through leverage or authority or the systematic application of pressure. What do you want?" The question was simple. 4 words. It should have been the easiest question in the world. It was, for Lucian Blackthorne, the hardest, because answering it required something that no amount of intelligence or discipline or strategic mastery could manufacture. It required honesty without armor, statement without caveat, the raw, unprotected act of telling another person what you want and accepting that the telling itself makes you vulnerable in ways that cannot be undone. He looked at her. "I want this to not be a transaction." Seraphina held his gaze. She held it the way she had held it on the first night, not because it did not hurt, but because the holding had become something else now, not an act of resistance, an act of recognition. 2 people seeing each other across a table in a room designed to make seeing impossible, and choosing to see anyway. Then stop treating it like one. "I do not know where to start." "You already started. You started when you read my evidence instead of dismissing it. You started when you stood up before I entered your study. You started when you asked for my help instead of demanding it. You started when you fought your way through armed men to protect someone you had spent 3 weeks trying to make irrelevant." She leaned forward, her hands on the table, close to his. Not touching. Not yet. "You are not reprogramming, Lucian. You are not replacing one system with another. You are discovering that the system you built to protect yourself was never the real you. It was the response to damage. The damage was real. The response was functional, but functional is not the same as alive, and you have been functional for 30 years and alive for approximately 4 days. The silence that followed was not the silence of the study, or the corridors, or the Great Hall, or any of the architectural silences that Ravenshade had been built to produce. It was the silence of 2 people sitting in a room that had been designed for isolation and filling it, slowly, imperfectly, with something that isolation cannot accommodate: presence. Mutual presence. The quiet, radical act of being in the same place at the same time and choosing to remain. Lucien moved his hand across the table. Not far. 2 inches. His fingers stopped next to hers without making contact, and the 2 inches of space between them contained more honesty than all the words that had been spoken in this castle in the past decade. Seraphina closed the distance. Her hand covered his, her fingers were warm against his split knuckles, and the contact was a frontier, the border between what he had been and what he might become if he could tolerate the uncertainty of becoming. His hand turned beneath hers, palm up, open. The most deliberately vulnerable gesture she had ever seen him make, and it was not a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of decision. The decision to stop building walls and start building something else. Something that required 2 people and could not be constructed from fear or control or the strategic management of emotional distance. The East Wing, Seraphina said, what happens to it now? It becomes whatever you want it to become. I want it to become a library. The central treasury is destroyed. The records need to be rebuilt. The East Dining Hall, with its 60 chairs and its obscene table and its acoustics designed for loneliness, would make an excellent archive. We fill it with new ledgers, new contracts, the documentary foundation of whatever Ravenshade becomes next. You want to turn your prison into a library? I want to turn your weapon into a tool. There is a difference. Weapons are designed for single use. Tools build things. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not a wall falling. Walls had been falling for days, something growing. The first structural element of something new being assembled in the space where the old architecture used to stand. Not yet complete. Not yet stable. A foundation. The kind of foundation that takes years to build properly, that requires patience and maintenance, and the daily, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing to construct something together that neither could construct alone. Done, he said. The same word, the same single syllable he had used when she demanded full access to the estate, but the weight of it was different now. Heavier, richer, loaded with a meaning that exceeded the transactional and entered the territory of the personal, which was, for Lucien Blackthorne, the most foreign territory of all. They sat in the East Dining Hall as evening turned to night. They did not move to the study. They did not retreat to separate quarters. They stayed. In the room that had been her prison. At the table that had been her isolation. Surrounded by 60 empty chairs that had been a monument to her irrelevance and were now, somehow, through the alchemy of survival and confrontation and the slow, brutal process of 2 people learning to see each other through the smoke of their own defenses, just chairs. Outside, the sea threw itself against the cliffs of Ravenshade with the same relentless persistence it had maintained for centuries. The sound came through the windows as rhythm, as pulse, as the steady bass note beneath the silence of 2 people sitting together in a room that was no longer empty. The duchy would be rebuilt. The records would be reconstructed. The tenants would be compensated. The alliances would be renegotiated from a position of transparency rather than fear. The aristocracy would learn, gradually and with considerable resistance, that challenging the Duke now meant facing not one adversary but 2. And the second was the more dangerous because she fought with numbers and evidence and the quiet, devastating precision of a woman who had walked into a fortress built to break her and had instead broken the fortress open and let the light in. Lucien Blackthorne remained the most formidable man in the duchy. His reputation did not soften, his authority did not diminish. His capacity for ruthlessness when the situation demanded it remained exactly as terrifying as it had always been. What changed was the loneliness. What changed was the cold machinery at the center of the power, replaced not with warmth that would come later, slowly, in increments so small they would be measured in individual moments rather than grand gestures, but with partnership. The specific, hard-won, forged-in-fire partnership of 2 people who had arrived at each other through conflict and stayed through choice. He was not a different man. He was the same man with one additional piece of information that altered the entire equation. The information was this: strength is not the ability to stand alone. Strength is the ability to stand alone and then choose not to. To extend your hand across a table to someone who has every reason to distrust you and hold it there, open, exposed, while they decide whether to take it. To accept that the taking is not guaranteed, that vulnerability is not weakness, that the most fortified position in the world is worthless if the person inside it is the only one there. He would still revert. He would still default to control when stress compressed his judgment and old patterns offered the familiar comfort of tested responses. He would still struggle with the basic vocabulary of human connection that most people learned as children, and he had been taught to view as a tactical liability. He would make mistakes. He would overcorrect. He would, on certain bad days, lock his study door and sit alone in the dark and feel the pull of the old architecture like a phantom limb, the absent walls still demanding to be obeyed. But he would open the door. Every time. He would open the door and walk down the stairs and find her in the library that used to be a dining hall, that used to be a prison, surrounded by the new ledgers and the reconstructed records, and the evidence that something could be built from wreckage if the people doing the building refused to stop. And Seraphina, who had arrived in a carriage on a frozen morning and looked up at a castle designed to intimidate and felt the full weight of its intention and walked inside anyway. Seraphina, who had eaten 1 egg and 1 cup of tea for 3 weeks and used the isolation not to break, but to think. Seraphina, who had stood in a dining hall with a candlestick and been willing to fight. She would stand beside him. Not behind, not below. Beside. In the position she had earned through competence, integrity, and the absolute refusal to be diminished by a man whose only language for love, before she arrived, was control. They would build Ravenshade into something its founders never intended and its history never predicted. An estate governed by partnership, a duchy administered through transparency, a fortress that still stood on its cliffs above the churning sea, still black, still imposing, still capable of inspiring the particular species of dread that had always been the Blackthorn signature, but with lights in the windows now. All of them. Every floor, every wing. Every room that had once been dark by design was now lit by choice, and the light visible from the sea on winter nights would become, over the years, a landmark, not of fear, of something harder to build and harder to destroy. The Duchess of Ravenshade put her hand over the Duke's. The Duke of Ravenshade let her, and outside the sea continued its ancient argument with the cliffs, and neither gave ground, and neither stopped trying, and the sound of it was not war. It was conversation, the kind that lasts.